Hello, folks. Today we are going to talk about finding silent spaces in your cueing. And this topic was requested a couple of weeks ago, and I'm really keen to be sharing it this week. And I really feel like I'm the perfect person to guide this discussion because I've struggled with overcueing for 25 years now. Part of the reason is I get really excited when I teach to share instructions and education and workshop poses and invite students to try different things, which are all great teaching strategies, except when I use them all at once with every pose. And for me, I feel a little bit like I create like a wall of sound. And at the end of class, like I've been shouting the whole time. And it makes me wonder, how do my students feel? Do they feel like they've been shouted at the whole time, pestered with my voice and interjections and ideas, and not really allowed to have their own experience or even their own thoughts? So today we're going to talk about how we can make some space for silence and for inquiry, for students to be able to experience each technique or each pose without new information or new instruction constantly coming in through our cues. So I'm going to share some notes and then we'll dig into our conversation. And I want to say that one of the ways that I've started to explore cueing versus over cueing is through music. I mentioned in my email that my husband is quite determined for me to be playing bass in his band. And I'm not very good and I haven't been practicing very much, but that's another story. But one of the results of starting to explore playing music is that I'm listening to music from a new perspective. And for me, that includes not just hearing what's there in each instrument, but hearing what's not there, the silence, the spaces between the music, and those spaces being just as important as the sounds of the instruments. And so I've really started to notice how important the silence between the notes are. And so you could imagine like a piece of music without any space would just be noise, noise, noise all the time. So when it comes to music, there's kind of a magic in the silence and the pauses and the space between, which we could imagine is kind of the same in your cueing. But this can take practice. And for some of us, it takes a lot of practice. I know one teacher described it as excruciating, trying to hold silent spaces. So how do we get more comfortable with silence? How do we know where to provide cues and where to include space? What techniques or skills or strategies can we develop? How do we know when's the right time for cues and when's the right time for space? So I've got a couple notes I wanted to share with you. First, when it comes to finding space, in our teaching, we are encountering some of the same urges as when we practice yoga. And one of those urges is to pay attention to the poses, but not the space between, the pauses, the rest, the transitions. And we can end up just waiting for the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and never spend time in those spaces between. So this can be about some of the philosophies that we talk about in yoga teacher training, balancing the doing and the not doing, or balancing present momentness with planning for what's next. And this brings in some philosophies like the kleshas or the yamas and niyamas, like santosha, contentment, svadhyaya, self-study, brahmacharya, right use of energy. So one interesting place to start finding space in your teaching strategies is, can you find a balance as a teacher in being present with what's happening now, being able to drop into the poses and the pauses while still having a sense of what's coming next without having to rush towards it? Next, taking a breath, especially if you find yourself rushed in your own breathing. trying to keep up the flow of cues, practice taking a breath between cues. So this gives students time to hear and understand and act on your cues, and it's going to give you a bit more breathing space in your teaching. So taking a breath. Next, 3 essential cues. So this is a place where your 3 essential cues practice is really useful, providing 3 essential cues that guide your students into a pose with breath, and then taking a pause to see how those cues have landed, and then making choices based on what you're observing about whether they need refining cues or safety cues or props or options cues. And this is helpful in not just running along, sharing every cue you've ever known about a pose without first looking to see if it's useful in this moment. And a reminder, what are the 3 essential cues? This is something we do in teacher training to kind of dig down to find a clear and efficient base for our cueing. So the exercise is, if you only had 3 cues to help students safely move into a pose with breath, what would those cues be? Next, letting go of control, even if that's just a little bit. So for me, part of reducing my cueing was in learning to let go of control of the class, not having to be in charge of every breath, every movement, every transition, every moment of the class. And that might mean providing instructive cues only and letting go of some of the details sometimes. That might mean letting go of some alignment rules as long as students are safe. For some teachers, that might mean not prescribing a particular rhythm or pace or even guiding every breath in a class. The benefit of this isn't just a bit more silent space in your class, but also handing back more agency and choice to your students. Practice being in a place of inquiry and choices and observation, rather than like a boot camp of just chasing the instructor's cues all the time. Next, and this is related, letting your students have an experience, allowing some space for students to be in a pose without micromanaging or providing more insights or getting ready to flow on. Inviting students to make choices about how they will make a shape, what regressions, progressions, versions, props, transitions, and then giving them space to make those choices and experience that choice in the pose or the technique, right? Another strategy is to sequence for silence. So if you feel like you're really rushed in your cues, consider reducing the quantity of poses in your sequence. It might be that you've just sequenced too many poses and you're trying to fit too many things in, and that's why you feel like there's a constant stream of talking. And you can also focus on creating a sequence where there are more deliberate spaces. That those spaces might be in Tadasana, mountain pose, or Shavasana, or child's pose. Focusing on quality rather than quantity. And this is something that takes practice. Now, in styles like Vinyasa Flow, I want to talk a little bit about pacing, because we're often using a 1 cue, 1 breath, 1 movement rhythm. So for instance, inhale, reach up, gaze up, exhale, forward fold, right? And this does require a more rhythmic stream of cues. So in the example of sun salutations, how we might make some silent space is perhaps teach with this rhythm for your first few salutations and then reduce your cues. Maybe you'll just cue the pose name. Maybe you'll just cue the breath. Or give your students a few rounds to do self-practice. So this can be a tricky balance in more dynamic styles like vinyasa flow. Students do need enough cues to safely move in and out of the pose with the breath, and some ideas on safe practice and pose options and props. And there's often a rhythm to yoga styles like vinyasa flow that your cues help to develop, but we shouldn't be beholden to that rhythm when it's not useful to our students. So that's just something to consider. And also when it comes to pacing, feel free to slow it down. So your first round of something like sun salutations, you could take a few breaths for each pose so that students have time to hear the cues and understand them, digest them, find their body in the pose, make some choices about how they're going to practice with regressions, progressions, or props. Then in subsequent rounds, you can add more pace and reduce your cues. They've got the information they need with a slower round or a few slower rounds, and then you can add pace and reduce your cues. So that's something to think about. Next, and I think this kind of goes to the heart of the question that inspired this whole discussion, is that sometimes we need to practice silence. So if you're uncomfortable in silence, know that this is something that can take some practice. And you might start with small moments of silence and see if you can hold that space for yourself. And maybe notice with those small moments of silence that usually everything's fine. The world doesn't fall apart. And then you can extend those moments of silence as you grow in your comfort and confidence. So this is something like you don't need to dive into the deep end and practice tons of silence all at once. You can dip a toe in, start to develop some comfort. Just like it took practice to stand on that mat at the front of the room and provide cues for a yoga class, it might take some practice to empower yourself and to grow confident in being silent on that mat at the front of the room. So those are some thoughts. Oh no, sorry, I have a few more strategies I want to share. Naming your poses can be useful in reducing your cues. So when you name your poses and you're consistent in naming your poses, your students will develop an awareness of what this name is and what the pose is going to be. So knowing the names of poses can help reduce some cueing. Reducing filler, like practice reducing filler phrases, like I want you to, now we're going to. That can create a little bit more space between cues. Repeating poses and reducing some cues in the second round can be a really interesting technique to play with. So, you teach through both sides of an asymmetrical pose, or you teach through a symmetrical pose, pause, take a break, and then guide students back into that pose and withdraw some cues. Let them have their own experience. Let them find their space in the posture or in the technique. And maybe on the second round, they'll try it again with a different version, a different prop, a different regression or progression. Really importantly, we want to ensure that we're cueing to what's happening now, that we're using cues that students need in the moment, rather than just running through a checklist of all the cues for a pose. And that might mean that you're going to start with instructive cues. So these are the do this, do that cues. Put your foot here, put your hand here, and then add layers of safety cues, imagery cues, like or as cues, refining cues, starting to dial into the nuances, or corrective cues or alignment cues as you need them. Be invitational in your cueing. Offer options and create a space for inquiry. So this requires time. We need to offer time for students to notice and feel and explore. So a simple cue like take a few breaths to feel yourself in this shape, and when you're ready, come back to whatever your resting place is, whether it be mountain or staff or child or shavasana. That can give students the chance to take their own time, and it can help you maintain a sense of rhythm in the class. So giving students, take a few breaths here, and then as students return, you'll know that it's time to go to the next place. If you do feel like with that technique, you've lost the rhythm of the class a little bit, you can help students return together with an on your next breath or when you're ready kind of cue, and then get back into the rhythm after a time of exploring. And that's another thing that I'll say takes a bit of practice, especially for those of us who've been teaching styles like Vinyasa Flow for a long time. Our natural setting is like controlling the pace throughout the entire class. And so it can take a little bit of practice to let go of having that pace control at all times. So it's an ongoing process. And again, giving yourself the time and space to develop these silent muscles, to develop the confidence and the comfort to hold those silent spaces. And that takes a little bit of time. So those are my thoughts on finding space and silence in your yoga teaching. Thanks for joining me and us, and I'll get this recording up. So yeah, thank you so much for participating and listening to my thoughts on silence, which took many words.